So my introduction is Michal Warzecha. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Is with us from Northern California, is what you have in your bio, but where are you exactly? Where do you live?
I am in El Dorado Hills, outside of Sacramento.
Okay, so you're south of here. I'd imagine.
Yeah.
So he's here on Zoom from El Dorado Hills. He will be speaking about the one secret Soviet lunar program, which proceeded alongside our own Apollo program. Michal was born in Poland, immigrated to Michigan as a child with his family. He became interested in space travel and astronomy when young. You can elaborate on that stuff if you want.
Okay.
He earned a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering at the University of Michigan, a Master's of Science in Mechanical Engineering at the University of Washington, and holds a professional mechanical engineering license with the state of California. Michal lives in Northern California with his wife and children. He enjoys mountaineering, amateur radio. A couple people here do that.
Yeah.
Long distance road biking. Is there anybody here that does that? Hey, Rod in the back. Reading, does anybody do that? And amateur astronomy, does anybody? A lot of people do that. He has over 30 years of experience working in aerospace and mechanical engineering. So let's welcome Michal.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to give this presentation. And in this discussion, I will talk about, obviously, what the Soviet Union was up to during the space race. And I'll be talking in parallel about what the United States was doing as well, because that gives a real understanding of the competition that was going on. And first, I'll start out with just a quick blurb about what the Soviet Union was. And it was at the world's largest country, and it was our main political adversary during the post-war period, and it existed for most of the 20th century. An important thing I want to bring up is the economic size of the Soviet Union, because this will be very pertinent to their lunar effort. In 1970, at the height of Apollo, the US had $1 trillion economy. The Soviet Union was a little over 400 billion. So there's a significant economic difference between the two countries. And they also had a bigger population. So when you look at the per capita, or the GDP per capita, the per capita income of the United States was over $5,000 per person. It was like over $1,000 in the Soviet Union, and that's going to be very important in this discussion. So going back to the Cold War, it lasted from the post-war period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, and it involved basically an arms race with missile technology as well as nuclear weapons, and that was the seeds of actually the space race. And in the late 60s, the Soviets were absolutely in the race to try to beat us to the moon. And this is a Time magazine image from December 1968, right before Apollo 8, showing an American astronaut and a cosmonaut running to reach the moon first. And the Soviets definitely said that they were in the game. This is a quote from Komarov, who was one of their cosmonauts. "I can positively state that the Soviet Union will not be beaten by the US in the race for a human being to go to the moon." Now, we all know how it ended. Between 68 and 72, there were 9 Apollo missions to the moon. And of those 9, 2 were orbital missions. There were 6 landings, and of course, Apollo 13, which was an aborted attempt at landing. And in this discussion, there are 2 dates that I really want to point out. And the first was for Apollo 8 in December 68, which involved having 3 astronauts orbit the moon. And then, of course, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon in July of 1969. And the Soviets congratulated us. They said, you know, this is from Pravda. I take this opportunity to congratulate the cosmonauts with outstanding success and wish them a safe return to Earth. And Neil Armstrong actually visited the Soviet Union in 1970, and he met with cosmonauts and government officials. And you know, there is a camaraderie between the cosmonaut corps and the astronaut corps as well, because they have a common goal and mission. However, they were backing away from claiming to have been in the space race. They said, "We concentrated wholly on the creation of large satellite systems," is what the Academy of Sciences said in 1969. And of course, they tried to turn it into a propaganda issue. And this is from Radio Moscow at the time, which said, "Apollo is the fanatical squandering of wealth looted from the oppressed peoples of the developed world." And it even got to the point where people like Walter Cronkite believed that they were not in the race. And I don't have his direct quote, but he said something to the effect of, Well, we were racing to the moon against ourselves. So this mythos that the Soviets weren't part of the race did develop at that time and stuck around for a few decades. And going back to how this all started, of course, we deployed 2 atomic bombs during World War II, and the Soviets developed a nuclear weapon only 4 years after us, which was a surprise to our intelligence agencies because we thought it would take them a lot longer. And at the time, to drop a nuclear bomb, you had to use aircraft, and aircraft would take hours to fly. You could turn them around, etc. However, in the late 50s, both the US and the USSR were trying to develop ballistic missiles. And with the ballistic missile, you could deploy a warhead to your adversary in about 30 minutes. And the first missile that the Soviets developed was called the R-7. The problem with the R-7 is it was a lousy missile. It could only stay on alert for a day, and it took almost a day to get ready. So if your adversary is launching a missile at you in 30 minutes, this missile is useless to retaliate. However, the R-7 made a great vehicle to launch into low Earth orbit. And the Russians now still use the R-7 base as a booster rocket for the Soyuz, which goes up to the International Space Station. And I'll mention a couple key players on the Soviet side. Of course, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the Soviet Union at the time of the 50s and early 60s. And there are two important people that helped launch their program, and that's Sergei Korolev, who was their best rocket designer and manager, and Valentin Glushko, who was their best engine designer for rocket engines. And both of them collaborated on the R-7. Now, Khrushchev was interested mostly in military applications, but there was this item that came up called the geophysical year, where scientists were encouraging the US and other industrialized nations to launch satellites. And Korolev convinced Khrushchev to let them launch a satellite. And what's interesting is both the United States and the Soviets had said that they will launch a satellite during the geophysical year. And that's exactly what the Soviets did. In 1957, they of course launched Sputnik. And that's the sound that the satellite made. If you had a shortwave radio, you could pick this up with just a conventional shortwave radio if Sputnik flew over your area. And this shocked the world because nobody expected the Soviets, who they said were technologically backward compared to the US in the post-war era, to be able to pull this off. The public was shocked. Our intelligence agencies actually knew this was going to happen. And also scientists knew that the Soviets said it, but it was still a very shocking sensation because now that just showed that the Soviets could drop a nuclear weapon on us because the same technology is used for nuclear weapon ICBMs, as well as launching rockets to space. And we had our effort. So working with the US Navy, we decided to try launching Vanguard 1. And this was broadcast on national TV and seen by the world. And our little satellite only got a couple feet off the ground. And this, of course, made a huge splash on headlines that embarrassed the United States. And the Soviets Khrushchev even offered technical aid to America, considering that they were behind the Soviet Union in technology. So very embarrassing for us. And we had a man working for the U.S. Army at the Redstone Arsenal named Werner von Braun. And he was the top rocket scientist in Nazi Germany who came to the U.S. in the post-war era. When we worked with the Soviet Union to defeat Germany, we, of course, were racing to catch these guys, and we got the lion's share of all the scientists that worked on rockets for the Germans. And he actually worked with the Army and did launch Explorer 1, which was our first satellite after Sputnik. So we're catching up. We're trying to recover. And one note to make is, even though frequently the Soviet Union beat us on the calendar, when we finally had our effort hit, like the first satellite, we actually had a bit of a more advanced technology with them. Like Sputnik could only send up a radio signal. Explorer 1, which came in the following year, could actually read data of the Van Allen belts and had other sensors in it. So it was a more advanced satellite. But what mattered most in world opinion, of course, was the calendar and that we were behind the Soviets. And the Soviets kept winning. They had the first animal launched in 1957, which was Warzecha on Sputnik 2. They did the first probe to fly by the moon. They did the first probe to hit the moon, the first probe to image the far side of the moon, and the first probe to fly by Venus in 1961. So they keep basically, you know, uh, embarrassing America because, we were very unhappy that they were doing this in our country. And Eisenhower decided to create a civilian space agency called NASA. And in 1958, he assigned Glennon to lead it. And of course, in 1960, still under Eisenhower, Wernher von Braun began working on the Saturn V moon rocket. He was the chief architect of it and also the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. So I want to point this out that the United States actually had a very centralized civilian effort in space travel. And the Soviet Union had a very different management style. And again, the wins keep coming. In 1961, the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin, who became the first man into space. And he did basically almost a full orbit around the Earth. And of course, he was celebrated as an international hero. Now, we tried to respond with the Mercury program, and Alan Shepard became the first American in space, but we only went on a suborbital flight. So the first two Mercury missions, including Shepard's, basically went up past the Kármán line and went into space, and then came right back down, a 15-minute flight compared to Gagarin's full orbit. It wasn't until almost a year later, in February of '62, that the Mercury capsule aboard an Atlas rocket actually did complete 3 orbits. So almost a year after Gagarin, we did our first orbital flight of an astronaut. And in 1961, President Kennedy took office, and he had a rough start during his term. He had the Bay of Pigs invasion that was embarrassing, and of course the Soviets had the first cosmonaut into space. And he gathered together with some of his scientific advisors and said, "What can we do to beat the Soviets?" And they concluded we can go to the moon. And he had his famous speech to Congress in 1961. And I think this speech is really important to look at because, in my opinion, it is one of the best mission statements a president has ever said, and it's very short and succinct. So he said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out." So this is a national effort. Before this decade is out, fixed time frame of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. So a very firm goal. No single space project will be more exciting or more impressive to mankind or more important. Again, huge national effort. And none will be so difficult. And basically he's saying it's going to be very complex or expensive to accomplish. And that's critical because going back to economics, $1 trillion economy, we could afford to do this. And NASA in the mid 60s was pulling 4.5% of the federal budget. Now it pulls less than 0.5%. And when Kennedy came to office, he appointed James Webb, who the Space Telescope is named after, to be the head of NASA. And he was one of the most capable administrators we ever had. And he basically ran the Apollo program and NASA itself and kept Wernher von Braun, of course, working at Marshall. And again, I would contrast this with the Soviet effort. And of course, when Johnson took power after the horrible death of Kennedy, he kept the continuity of the program going, which is unique in some ways because even when the party doesn't change, frequently when an administration changes, they do change up the space program and also the space goals, and he didn't. And the way that the US does aerospace contracting is they hire private companies to do the work. NASA does not build any hardware. The government doesn't build it. Private contractors do. And I've done this work at a private contractor. So the competition is only when they bid on contracts. So NASA says, "I want a lunar module," and several companies bid it. The lowest bidder was Grumman. They got the contract, and there was no more competition to build that lunar module. And the U.S. would go to any company that had the skills needed. If you notice, in the lower left-hand corner is the Playtex company. Playtex, which we know makes women's clothing, actually made the spacesuits because they understood material science and how to make stuff that was, durable and comfortable. So the Playtex company made the spacesuits that you see on the moon. And John Glenn summed up this effort when he was flying on his Mercury capsule. He said, "As I hurtled through space, one thought kept crossing my mind. Every part of this rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder." And I've worked in contracting before, and I can tell you stories about that. But it's interesting how we run things sometimes in aerospace. Now, the Soviet program was very different. What the Soviets did is they had government-run design bureaus that designed the hardware and actually built it. So, for example, Sergei Korolev ran his design bureau, and in the 1960s, early 60s, Khrushchev told him to do studies on a moon rocket, the N-1. And at the same time, he told somebody named Helomi in a separate design bureau to design a lunar rocket also to fly around the moon. And this reflects a tradition in the Soviet Union at the time of avoiding power concentrations in bureaus. So they, by nature, made these bureaus compete with each other because they didn't want anybody having all the goods. And there was a lot of really fierce, aggressive rivalry in these design bureaus. And Glushko, who was his partner on the R-7, the best rocket engine designer at the time in the Soviet Union, hated Korolev. They hated each other, and they refused to work together after the R-7. And part of the reason was during the Stalin era, Glushko denounced Korolev, and Korolev was sent to the Gulag for several years, where he was very horribly treated. So there was no love lost between those two. And as he's designing the rocket, the N-1 rocket, which will be the competitor for the Saturn V, he does not have Glushko as a partner. So he picked a guy named Kuznetsov, who was a able jet engine designer, but had no experience in designing rocket engines. So remember this point, because this will come into play with how their Saturn V version called the N-1 did not work. And also mandates were not solid or backed up with appropriate resources. Again, 40% size economy compared to what we have had. And with Kennedy's goal, the USA came out of the gate running. You know, we had probes that we would send to the moon to photograph it and to soft land on it. And we started what was called the Gemini program. I'll talk about that. And then we began designing and testing the lunar hardware right off the bat. And there had been studies on doing these things before Kennedy did his mandate. So there was some engineering work that happened beforehand. But once Kennedy gave his mandate and Congress said, yes, we'll give you basically a blank check, the race was on. Now, the Soviet program began with a rocket called the Vostok. And this was a lot like Mercury. It flew one cosmonaut. They had 6 flights. They had, of course, the first man in space. They had a simultaneous flight, which was not a true rendezvous, but they had 2 Vostoks up at the same time. And they had the record for a solo flight, which was almost 5 days. And they had the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, so another first. And it took us, let's see, 20 years to have the first American woman in space with Dr. Sally Ride on board the shuttle. And the Vostok itself was like Mercury. It couldn't do a lot. Both Mercury and Vostok could basically go into orbit and come back down. They couldn't maneuver very well. They couldn't change orbit. They could not do a true rendezvous where 2 spacecraft meet up in space. They couldn't do a docking either, which are critical things for a moon landing. And both of us were trying to improve our spacecraft. So the next Soviet spacecraft was called Voskhod in 64, 65. And it was basically a modified Vostok capsule. And they only had 2 flights. Now, the key difference was this was still like the Vostok, a first generation spacecraft. It could only go up into low Earth orbit and come back down. No maneuverability, no docking, etc. And they beat us again with the first. In 1964, they had the first multi-crew flight of 3 cosmonauts. But what they did is they stripped everything out of the Voskhod capsule. So they had no spacesuits, no pressure suits, no escape system, all because they had to cram 3 of these guys into that Voskhod sphere. And thankfully they made it, but basically they were really flying on a shoestring to do that. And again, still a first generation spacecraft. The second flight was also another first, Vostok 2. They pulled off the first spacewalk and they beat us again. Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut, was somebody who did that spacewalk. He was a very important person in the space program. And what's interesting is that flight actually landed 240 miles off target when they came back in. And this is a great flight to study if you're into space history. They landed 240 miles off course in a remote Russian forest in March. They were freezing and they had wolves surrounding their sphere at night. And it took a couple days for the Soviet military to find them. And to top it off, they couldn't land next to them, so they had to have a military mountaineering team on skis go out and meet them, hand them a couple of skis. There were two guys there, and they had to ski out to their helicopter and finally get back to warmth and comfort. And again, great story to read about. And Alexei Leonov was uh, quite the pioneer. If the Soviet Union had pulled off a lunar landing, he likely would have been the first person to walk on the moon. And I'll talk about him a little bit more later. Now, at the same time as Voskhod, we were innovating significantly. We had the Gemini program, where we launched a two-person capsule into space, and we had 10 missions with people on this. And unlike the Vostok or the Voskhod, the Gemini could change orbits. And we had 10 flights again that did a rendezvous where two capsules were flying at the same time. They flew within 1 foot of each other. We did docking practices where we had some of the Gemini missions dock with a unmanned target. And we also did spacewalks, and we did multiple spacewalks. And this is the moment where we leapfrog the Soviet Union because we had a substantial advance in technology compared to their Voskhod system. And what's interesting is we had 10 flights on Gemini, but they only had 2 on Voskhod. And after Voskhod 2, there was a multi-year pause in their flight regime. So they're already getting behind at this point, and we're still 3 or 4 years before Apollo 11 lands. And the critical thing that Gemini did that the Voskhod didn't do is again it tested hardware, operations, human factors for going to the moon. And when we eventually did do the Apollo program, out of the 11 Apollo missions, 10 of them had a Gemini veteran, at least one Gemini veteran on there because of all of their experience. And all 3 of the crew on Apollo 11 had a Gemini flight prior to Apollo 11. And also, again, going back to robotic probes, the Soviets beat us on landing a probe on the moon with Luna. They had 2 landings, but we were right on their tail. We had 5 successful landings of Surveyor. So even though they beat us on the calendar, uh, we had more landings, and our spacecraft could do more things compared to the Soviet Luna lander. And of course, we had orbital reconnaissance of all of our potential landing sites for Apollo. And we came up with a really simple, is kind of the wrong word, but a basic scheme of how to go to the moon. We basically built a skyscraper called the Saturn V, 360 feet tall, weighed over 6 million pounds, 7.5 million pounds of thrust from the first stage. And it basically had 2 spacecraft that would get to the moon. We had a command and service module, which would carry all 3 astronauts, and we had a lunar module, which would land on the moon. And it was simple. This setup was what the Saturn V put into lunar orbit. So this command module would stay in lunar orbit. 2 of the guys would go into the lunar module. 1 guy stayed in orbit. And the lunar module would fly to the moon, or fly from lunar orbit to the surface. The astronauts would do their business on the moon, plant the flag, collect rock samples, and do science. And then when they were done, the upper part of the lunar module would take off from the moon and redock with the command and service module. The 2 guys would transfer back to the capsule, and then they would fly home using this spacecraft and re-enter. So, a 6 million pound rocket, which eventually brought back this small capsule, 3 guys, and at most a few hundred pounds of moon rock per mission. And it just shows how complex and hard it is to escape Earth's gravity well, get to the moon and come back. And we were flight testing like crazy. We did two Saturn V unmanned flights. We tested the lunar module unmanned in Earth orbit. We were testing all of the systems, and this is important. Again, this will be a contrast. Every single rocket engine we built was ground tested, except for the ones on the lunar module. There's a reason behind that. But all of the main engines on the Saturn V were all ground tested, both as singular engines and in clusters, as if they were simulating the spacecraft. So when this is all going on, there's a ton of turmoil going on with the Soviets. And finally, in 1964, 3 years after Kennedy's vision to Congress, the Central Committee of the Soviet Union finally said, you know what? We're going to have a manned lunar landing between 1968 and 1970 with Korolov's N-1 rocket that he's developing. And then in 1964, they said, well, you know what? 1967 is the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, so we're going to land a man on the moon in 1967, and we'll do a lunar orbital flyby in 1966. And so again, you've got Korolev working on the N1 for landing, and you had Hilomi working on the orbital portion. And there were a lot of, I'm not going to go into the details, but there were a lot of changes in these configurations going on. So these configurations for these rockets were not static throughout all of this. And that was another problem they had is with us on the Saturn V, we pretty early set up what the plan was for the landing and the architecture. The Soviets were still trying to get their act together because they kept changing everything. And Khrushchev was ousted in 1964, and Leonid Brezhnev took over. And Brezhnev wasn't so interested in firsts, so it lost some of the momentum there from Khrushchev. And Korolev died in 1966, so that was a huge blow to the Soviet program. And he died during surgery. He was replaced by his deputy, Mishin, and Mishin did not have the connections, he did not have the political savvy or the managerial skills of Korolev. So that also significantly hurt their efforts. So at this point, they're already 3 years behind. They have less economic power, and they just lost their most competent rocket engineer in 1966. And one thing that Korolev had tried to develop was the Soyuz. And one thing about Soviet engineering is, you know, on the American side, we tend to always uh, reinvent the wheel to some extent. So when we have a new spacecraft, we'll use it for several years, and then all of a sudden we say, we have a better plan. Let's do this next generation of spacecraft. The Soviets tend to take the attitude of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like I said, they're still using, you can see on the lower right-hand corner, the basic R7 architecture. Again, they improve it over time incrementally, but they're still using the R7 architecture to launch people into space. And the Soyuz is still being used till this day, 50, 60 years later after its development. And when they were developing it, they said they could seat 3 cosmonauts, and there were 3 versions in work: an Earth orbit version, a lunar version, and a military version. And the problem was in the Soviet bureaucracy, the military and civilian efforts fought for resources, and the military had contempt for regular space exploration. And what happened with this, developing the Soyuz is the design was solidified in 62, but the military variants had the lion's share of resources. And when they were trying to test this thing with unmanned flights, they were plagued with lots of problems and failures. So even though right now the Soyuz is a real workhorse and a pretty reliable spacecraft, it had a lot of growing pains back in the mid 60s. And both of us had suffered tragedies by 1967. And a lot of it was because we were just trying to race as fast as we could to get to the moon, both America and the USSR. And we all know about the Apollo 1 tragedy that happened in 1967, where we lost Grissom, White, and Chaffee in a plugs out test on the launch pad due to a horrific fire. But the Soviets also had a tragedy a few months later. They launched Soyuz 1 with a solo cosmonaut named Komarov. And he had problems during the entire flight. The solar panel didn't deploy, he didn't have power, systems weren't working. They were supposed to launch a Soyuz 2 to accompany him, but they never did at that time. And he did re-enter safely, but when he hit the atmosphere, his parachute failed, and he had absolutely no deceleration, and he died from basically free falling into the ground. And again, like in our case with Apollo 1, a lot of this happened because they were rushing to get the Soyuz ready. And unfortunately, on both sides, four astronauts and one, excuse me, three astronauts and one cosmonaut lost their lives. And both programs had a significant pause. Neither us or the Soviets would launch a mission until late 1968. And going back to the efforts of having two different platforms to do a lunar flight, they did work on the Proton or the Zond, which was supposed to send a cosmonaut around the moon. And they did about a dozen flights of this thing with no people. They did autonomous flights. And four of these actually flew around the moon. And they had lots of technical issues. They never carried a crew. So this configuration of this Proton rocket with a Soyuz variant never flew manned, only 12 unmanned missions. And again, reentry was one of their biggest challenges. And in 1968 in September, they flew their first mission to go around the moon. And they carried turtles, and I don't know why they picked turtles, but they carried turtles, and they transmitted taped cosmonaut voices to test communications. And what's interesting is NASA was monitoring this, and they were worried that the Soviets beat us again with a crew to lunar orbit. And this was also making everybody nervous because they had to do an Apollo 8 flight in December 1968. So this kind of was like the ultimate punking that the Russians did because, I'm sure that they kind of smiled when they put the tape recorder under and said, yeah, I'll bet you the Americans are going to think this is a manned flight. And they had a window of 2 weeks before Apollo 8, which again was the mission to have astronauts orbit the moon for the first time. They had a chance to actually fly a manned version of this, but they did not take advantage of it. And it probably was because they were worried about the technology having issues and the possibility of losing a crew, so they did not want to take the risk. Now, going back to the N-1 rocket. So this was Korolov's dream of having this rocket put people on the moon. And it was about the same size as the Saturn V. And it didn't have the capability of the Saturn V. It could only launch half the payload to the moon, but it was still, on paper, something that could have pulled off a lunar landing, albeit, on a much smaller scale because of the payload reduction. And here was their plan. It does kind of echo our plan. They would only launch two cosmonauts, and it would have been Alexei Leonov, likely, and Makarov, his teammate. And they would have two spacecraft. On the right, you can see that there's a Soyuz lunar orbital craft and an LK lander. And there were significant design differences, though. If you look at this, on the left-hand side, we have the Saturn V rocket. So the American philosophy, 5 massive F1 engines on the first stage to get it off the pad. Rocket weighed over 6 million pounds. They had 5 1.5 million pound thrust rocket engines, so 7.5 million pounds of sheer thrust hitting it. On the right is the first stage of the N1 that Korolev designed. And this is critical because this shows that he did not have the chief, or the best engine designer, Glushko, to work with him. This is because he had his engine designer had a very different philosophy. He went with smaller engines, 30 of them, and he would change the thrust values on the engines to steer it. So this is much more complicated to pull off because when you have that many engines, you're going to get interference between the engines. You have more chances of failure. There's lots of technical challenges you have to do on this type of architecture. And interestingly enough, Elon Musk is doing this type of architecture on the Super Heavy. And of course, they had 4 stages. We had 3. And just like us, each stage had a smaller number of engines. And here was how they would do it. So they would send a similar configuration with a Soyuz orbiter on the right and an LK lander on the left. Now, in the American program, when the 2 spacecraft were docked in lunar orbit, there was a tunnel in between the spacecraft, and the astronauts could go between the 2 spacecraft freely. If you ever watch Apollo 13, you can see that happening. The Soviets didn't have the technology to do a tunnel. So what they would do is have a spacewalk. So when they were docked in lunar orbit, one cosmonaut would leave the Soyuz and then enter the LK lander. And then the LK lander would undock. The Soyuz orbiter would stay in space with one cosmonaut, and then one cosmonaut would descend to the surface. And they would use a booster element to decelerate the lander as it came to the moon, and then dump that. We didn't do that. Our architecture had only 2 stages, and the descent stage on the Apollo lunar lander would do the deorbiting as well as the landing. And then they would land on the moon. And just like with us, they would gather rocks, plant a flag, and do some scientific work. And then their lander would take off just like ours. But there's a critical engineering difference, which is kind of scary. On our lander, we had a dedicated engine for landing and a dedicated engine for ascent to rejoin the orbiter up in lunar orbit. The Soviets would use the same engine for both operations once they dumped that little booster stage. So they would use the same engine to land and the same engine to take off again, leaving just that little framework of feet there. And here was the big danger that they had to deal with. This is the Apollo 15 lander that crunched the descent nozzle on the lunar module. For us, that was not a big deal because we would not be using that engine anymore. Now, if you're on an LK lander and did that, you're going to be marooned. So what the Soviets did is they had a backup plan where they would land a LK lander autonomously on the moon near where they wanted to land a cosmonaut. So that way, if the cosmonaut had a damaged engine, he could go to the autonomously landed one and still have a chance of getting back into orbit. And they also had a smaller backup engine just in case to try to break into orbit. So different architecture. And then when they're done, of course, the lander redocks with the orbiter. They have another spacewalk. The cosmonaut has to get back into the Soyuz sphere, or capsule rather. And then, of course, the orbiter dumps the lander and then flies back to Earth. And this is kind of a scale set of photographs of the LK lander on the left and the American lunar module on the right. So our module was bigger and it was 3 times heavier. And again, a lot of that was the N1 didn't have the payload capacity of the Saturn V. And just a couple quick comparisons, single astronaut to the moon, dual astronaut, single cosmonaut to the moon, 2 astronauts to the moon in our case. The Soviet LK had about a 48-hour service life. Ours was around 3 days. And here's another critical difference. Apollo had a full-up true guidance computer. The Apollo AGC was actually a 2 megahertz computer. And they also had two pilots. So you had the commander, like in Apollo 11's case, Neil Armstrong, who was steering the spacecraft. And then on the right, you had Buzz Aldrin, who was basically helping him by reading all the instruments. And he was giving him call-outs as to what was going on. So again, a lot of that was because of limited technology in the 60s. But you had 2 people working it and a powerful computer. Soviets had 1 cosmonaut. So he was in charge of everything. And not only that, he didn't have a true guidance computer. He had a guidance calculator. So he had to do a lot of the math to try to get the spacecraft down as well. So as far as pilot tasking, the Soviets had a much more challenging job ahead of them to be able to land on the moon. And a lot of the details were similar. So hypergolic propellants, which means that when the oxidizer and fuel touch, they ignite on contact, which is very smart to do because it's highly reliable. And both vehicles ran on batteries. They both used landing radar, and ours had twice the hover time. So you had much less margin on the Soviet LK lander. And what's interesting is we did not know about this lander till 1989. So this was a state secret that was kept by the Soviets until the Berlin Wall came down. And one of the landers that survived that was never flown is actually in London in a museum. And that's where the photograph was taken. So they did test fly the lander. They flew the lander into Earth orbit, and it actually worked really well. They had 3 flights that succeeded, but do notice the dates of the flights: November 1970, February 71, August 71. So when we're winding down Apollo, they're just doing their first unmanned test flights of their lander. And again, we didn't know about this till the late 80s. And they also were trying to uh, test fly their N1 rocket, their Saturn V version. And this is a neat photograph. This is a reconnaissance image from the National Reconnaissance Office of an overflight of the Baikonur Space Center in the Soviet Union. And this was what looks like an N1 rocket on the pad in September 1968. So this added pressure, again, for the US, we got to keep going. The Soviets are up to something. And this wound up being a mock-up, and the CIA thinking it probably was, but they couldn't be certain that it was a mock-up. So again, we're thinking, oh boy, they're going to try to beat us again. And the CIA was so into this that this is recently declassified. This is a scale model of the Baikonur N1 facility. And if you look at the scale model, you can see that on the bottom left-hand corner, there is a Saturn V rocket, a Washington Monument for scale, and an N1 rocket to the right of it. So I need to find out where this is and go see it, because this is a great piece of space race history right here that was declassified, I think, in the last 10 years or so. And again, these are more photographs that they had of the N1 tower. This is in June of '69. So yeah, we knew what they were up to, and the hardest part was trying to figure out, how far are they in doing this, and can they jumpstart us again? So going back to the N1, they did test fly it, thankfully unmanned, and they had 4 launches, and all 4 of them failed. The first one was in February 1969, so we're talking just a few months before Apollo 11. And 70 seconds into the flight, the first stage had a fire due to what's called pogo oscillation, where the rocket moves forward and back. There's various reasons for that to happen, and it started tearing up the systems inside of it. The computer shut down the rocket, and it basically blew up. Then in July of '69, couple weeks before the Apollo 11 flight, an N1 rocket had what's called FOD, where a few seconds after launch, a piece of debris was stuck in one of the engine turbines, and it caused the engine to basically explode and take out the rocket. And this was, again, right at the launch pad. And the CIA discovered this because that's the carnage on one of their launch pads for the N1. So we knew that, yeah, they tried to launch something big and it didn't work out too well. And again, this is declassified not that long ago. They tried another flight in 1971, again, 2 years after Apollo 11. But their guidance system had issues and the rocket began rolling. Aerodynamic forces tore it apart. They had one more try of launching this thing unmanned. And the first stage was about to shut down, and they were going to ignite the second stage, but some of the loads during shutdown caused damage and caused the rocket to explode. And they only made it 107 seconds into the mission. So why did they fail as far as their N1 effort, where we were fairly successful with the Saturn V? First one, again, was lack of resources. They never tested their individual NK1 engine, NK15 engines in their first stage of the N1. They only sample tested. And I've seen various reports that say that they tested 1 out of 6 engines or 1 out of 3. Again, it's hard to get primary sources out of Russia, so I have to rely on secondary sources. But nevertheless, they only tested a fraction of their engines on ground tests. Most of the engines on their N1 rocket had never been fired before. They would use what's called variable thrust, where they would change the thrust level of the engines to steer it. And that's more complicated. We actually use what's called gimbaling, where we had hydraulics to steer the engines and basically move the engines back and forth or forward and aft and make that steer the rocket. I mentioned Elon Musk on the Super Heavy. He does go with a smaller engine compared to a Saturn V. So he's got 32 engines on the cluster of the Super Heavy, just like the N1. But he also gimbals his engines. He does not do variable thrust for steering. He does gimbal like we do. And they could only stand to lose 2 engines if there was an issue, and that would cause a loss of 4 engines because the computer would have to balance out the lost engine. And their computer was cutting edge for the time, and it had to be developed and it had its own issues. And a huge problem in the Soviet space program was safety and FOD. And FOD again is foreign object debris. A piece of debris took out a turbopump and caused the rocket to explode. And in aerospace, FOD is a huge problem that you have to deal with. And unfortunately, the track record of safety in the Soviet Union was not great. I'm not going to go into details on this, but one of the biggest disasters they had was in 1960, where they were testing an ICBM. This was called the Nedeline disaster, where they were rushing to get the rocket done, and they were cutting corners, and it tragically killed at least 90 engineers, technicians, and scientists. It could have been as high as 300. And you could do a whole talk about this whole tragedy that happened in 1960. But it's kind of indicative of one of the issues they had in their space program was of trying to cut corners and cut costs. And as the program kept developing, they did have some firsts. Not first, but some accomplishments though. They did finally get the Soyuz system running in 1968, and they had a successful flight. In 1969, 4 years after Gemini did this, they did start practicing docking maneuvers between Soyuz spacecraft. And they did launch the world's first space station in 1971. And that's when both us and the Soviets began focusing on low Earth orbit as compared to the moon. In 1972, of course, we had Apollo 17, which was the last lunar landing and the 6th lunar landing from the United States. And as mentioned, we began focusing on the Skylab and low Earth orbit with the space shuttle as well. By 1974, the Soviet Union canceled the N1 program after their 4th failure. And unfortunately, they destroyed all the hardware that they had left over because, again, they wanted to not acknowledge that they had failed. And as an amateur space historian, I would love to be able to see that hardware because that's an important part of human history. And by 1976, Glushko, who was their engine designer, began working on the Soviet space shuttle. So by the mid-70s, the moon race was over. And to this day, the Soviet Union or Russia hasn't tried to land on the moon. And currently, the US is the only nation that has successfully landed a human on the moon. And of course, that's going to be changing with Artemis, as well as the Russian-Chinese effort that's going on in this decade. So I want to end with an important question, though, is could the Soviet have won the moon race? And the first question we have to ask is, what was our chances what were the chances of the United States of actually pulling it off? And our success was not guaranteed. We had significant technical challenges that could have easily stalled the Apollo program. One of them was we had problems with the F1 engine on the Saturn V. And the Soviets actually, it was revealed, were counting on the Apollo program stalling. And that's part of the reason why, even though they were behind, they didn't stop. And here's a scenario. I mean, if you think about it, in 1967, of course, we had the tragic Apollo 1 fire, which could have canceled the program. Apollo 11 landed with less than 40 seconds of fuel left, and they had computer problems and everything else. That landing could have easily become an aborted attempt. Apollo 12, which would have been the next attempt in 1969, was struck by lightning twice at liftoff. When the lightning hit them, it knocked out the guidance computer in the command and service module. Luckily, it missed the guidance computer for the Saturn V because the Saturn V had its own computer system. So as they're trying to figure out what happened for mission control, they've lost all their systems, but the little guidance computer in the Saturn V just kept humming along and kept guiding the rocket until they figured out how to get their systems back up. If that lightning bolt had gone a little bit differently, it could have easily taken out the Saturn V guidance computer and they absolutely would have aborted the mission. And then, of course, we have Apollo 13, which happened in April of 1970. So there was a realistic chance that we could have missed Kennedy's goal and been delayed. And the Soviets wanted that to happen to try to catch up. However, if with no delays, though, given the larger size of the economy of the US, the fact that we had a very precise controlled leadership vision, we had the resources to do it, we had a pretty fair chance of winning the Kennedy's goal. So could the Soviets have beaten us in the existing timeline? Well, as mentioned, the N-1, Soyuz, and LK were not sufficiently developed by 1969 to have a realistic chance of beating Apollo 11, nor did they have the operational experience to pull it off. But if they didn't have some of the engineering issues on the Zond, and if they had solved them, they could have feasibly beaten us with Apollo 11's orbital mission on the moon. That was a real possibility. So maybe they couldn't have pulled off a landing, but they definitely had a chance to pull off an orbital mission before us. And if Apollo had stalled past 1970, it could have justified more resources into the N1. And even though the Soviet architecture was riskier, with more time they could have developed it better and probably reduced risk. So if they continued with the N1 past 1972, there's a chance they could have done a landing by the mid-70s with the architecture they had. And also, if they didn't rush the Soyuz 1 and avoided the death of Komarov and the delays of waiting until 1964 to really dive into the program, that's the kind of stuff they would have had to do. So the last bit I want to say is, could we get, our stainless steel DeLorean, 1.5 gigawatts of energy and go back to 1960 and actually change things to make a red star over the moon a real possibility? Well, to pull that off, one of the best ways to do it would basically be to copy us. So create a NASA, a Soviet NASA, have a centralized space organization, forget all the bureaus fighting each other, and have a single vision from that type of organization. And what's ironic is Korolev actually requested this in 1959 to Khrushchev, but Khrushchev said, no, we're not going to do that. Appoint Korolev, because Korolev was a brilliant manager with the same role as James Webb. Have him oversee the entire lunar program and also forget the competition between the bureaus. Somehow reconcile with Glushkov, the chief engine designer. If I don't know how realistic that was, but if those two guys could play nice, that would have been a powerful combination for a lunar rocket. Have Khrushchev respond to Kennedy's vision in 1961 and have a similar thing saying, we also choose to go to the moon, and put the resources behind it. Don't wait till 1964. Bridge the divide between the military and civilian aerospace organizations in the Soviet Union. NASA is a civilian organization, but they absolutely use lots of military resources. We could not have gone to the moon without the US Navy helping us pull the capsules out of the ocean. Design one class of rocket for the lunar flights. Don't do the Proton and the N1 concurrently. pick a single architecture to do both roles of an orbital mission or landing mission, just like we did. Saturn V did the orbital mission in Apollo 8 and did 6 landings. Start the Soyuz earlier with more resources and have a Gemini-like spacecraft earlier instead of having a Voskhod, which is still a first-generation spacecraft in the mid-60s. Apply more engineering and economic resources for testing and research, especially early. Improve quality control. That would have gone a long way in the Soviet Union as far as their aerospace efforts was to improve quality control and safety. And obviously, this would require a significant cultural shift in Soviet politics and administration. Basically, for them to realistically beat us, it would require the Soviets to stop being Soviets in the 1960s. How realistic is that? I, you know, I don't think very, but I would say one thing about history is nothing is inevitable. There's always a chance that things happen. So if you were trying to convince Khrushchev to land a man on the moon, in my humble opinion, this is how you would need to do it. But again, I don't think it would have been very realistic to pull off. And the last bit is there was a lot of good that came out of the space race. And in 1975, we had the Apollo-Soyuz test mission, where an American Apollo command and service module with 3 astronauts docked in low Earth orbit with a Soyuz with 2 cosmonauts aboard. And this was a great historical event seen around the world. And that's Deke Slayton, who was one of the American astronauts with Alexei Leonov, meeting up in space. And this is the first mission that I watched as a kid. And I remember my parents put this on TV and I was watching this launch. And I probably would have been a civil engineer if it wasn't for this launch, because this is what hooked me to space. Ever since that day of watching this mission, I said, I want to be an astronaut. I never did, but I got the consolation prize of becoming an aerospace engineer.
Mhm.
And cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, which was what happened with the Soviet Union after the Cold War ended. We did do space shuttle missions to their space station, and of course, the Russians helped build the International Space Station. And unfortunately, over the last decade, the cooperation has basically disintegrated. We're still cooperating on the ISS, but unfortunately, it's pretty much ending now. And with the Artemis mission, the Russians are not involved. So right now, we basically are having a divorce as far as our cooperation, which is a shame because we covered a lot of ground beginning with Apollo-Soyuz into the 90s and 2000s. So the last thing I want to point out is this is, again, Alexei Leonov, and he was one of the best ambassadors for American and Russian space relations. The Apollo-Soyuz crew of the Americans and the Russians became very close friends. They were lifelong friends. And Leonov was also an accomplished artist. This is from the Apollo-Soyuz mission, and he is holding a sketch of the American commander, Tom Stafford. And he did a lot of artwork which showed space travel and the incredible experience of doing it. One of my colleagues from the University of Michigan who wound up working at NASA actually personally knew Leonov, and he said he was a very friendly guy, very cordial, and he would always hug you when he met you. And unfortunately, he did pass away a few years ago. But if you ever want to study Soviet space, he is one of the most important people involved, and one person that's worthy of study, and somebody who, if the Soviet lunar effort had succeeded, he likely would have been the first person to walk on the moon. So with that, I probably dumped a lot of information here, but I'll go ahead and be happy to try to answer questions.
What's going on in Russia now in terms of their space activities?
That's an excellent question. What's happening now is, and again, we're back into a space race. We of course have the Artemis program. We've got 60 countries right now going to the moon. I'm not all of them obviously going to go, but they're all working on the effort. And let me show you this slide. the Russians are working with China and 11 other countries to do also a comparable lunar effort. So right now, the Russians basically are decoupling their manned program from us, and they're setting up a competition to go to the moon with the Chinese. And that's part of the reason I think that we are trying to get Artemis going as fast as possible, because they're actually moved up the launch date of Artemis to February 6th.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, I want to know what happened with the rocket that blew up in the 80s.
The
Wasn't there
rocket that blew, which rocket that blew up in the 80s?
the one that had the teacher that was going in it for the
Ah,
first
okay, yes, yes,
yeah.
yes, that was Kristen McAuliffe. That was the Challenger mission. And what happened on that one is that was an unfortunate mismanagement by NASA. Uh, they, the space shuttle had several delays prior to that flight. And then the night before that flight, they had an extremely cold day at NASA in Florida, because we launched out of Florida. So they had below freezing temperatures. And if you look at the space shuttle, on the sides of the space shuttle, there are those solid rocket boosters, those white rockets on the side. I wish I had a photograph of it. But the rockets would use solid fuel. And solid fuel is basically like the model rockets that kids play with. And they would stack these joints of solid fuel to stack up this rocket. And between those joints was a rubber seal. And that would keep the hot exhaust gases from the rocket from escaping outside. The cold weather made those rings brittle. And when they launched, there was a leak of rocket exhaust that basically put a blowtorch against the fuel tank of the space shuttle, that giant brown fuel tank. And what happened is that breached the fuel tank, and it spilled all of the propellant into the air. It didn't explode, it conflagrated. So it caused all the propellant to ignite. And it pushed the shuttle away. The shuttle survived the conflagration, but what happened is, because they're going at supersonic speed, it went into an orientation where the aerodynamic loads just ripped it apart. And the crew likely survived the fall, but died on impact with the ocean. So yeah, we lost 7 brave astronauts. And the mistake was, management was pushing the launch under cold weather. The engineers that designed the rocket said, we didn't design this thing for those low temperatures. But they said, well, they asked them, will this fail? And they said, well, we can't say, but we're beyond our requirements. And they said, okay, fine, I want you to still launch then. So it was a horrific managerial mistake that caused the tragedy of the 7 astronauts being
4 years
killed.
ago, late January '86.
January 86, yep.
Late January '86. Almost 4 years ago, yeah. God,
January 28th, yep. I was in high school. We didn't watch the launch, but they announced it.
Yeah.
It's a day, I'll never forget.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that the Russians didn't have any kind of rendezvous in orbit like we had in the Gemini program. I remember that was a big deal.
Yep,
In the World's Fair, they had this big display, and they showed that this is one of the important steps in getting to the moon.
yep,
And I think you said they started doing that in 1969. I mean, it seems to be a
yeah.
little. Had they from the beginning plan on having a lunar orbiter and then a landing? Because I don't think we had known we were going to do that early in the space race. So maybe, did they just adopt our system?
They did, and I didn't go over these details, but they, back in the early stages of their development, they were thinking, oh, we can do, multiple rocket flights or set up this type of. So they were dancing around with configurations, and they realized that just technically, yes, the lunar orbit rendezvous made the most sense. And the reason that they didn't practice it till so late is you need a second generation spacecraft. You need a spacecraft that can change orbit. And the Vostok Voskhod just did not have that capability, and they didn't push it hard enough, and largely because Khrushchev kind of didn't take Kennedy seriously for the first couple of years.
So is it true that when you're rendezvousing in space, you can't just do it visually? You need computers to kind of figure out how to do it. Was that one of the problems they had? Because that was, we had to develop the computers to be able to
to achieve that.
That's part of the issue. And the Gemini actually had a guidance computer. It was more primitive than Apollo, but it actually was also a guidance computer. But yes, because you have to figure out all the physics of coming up from the Earth and then meeting up in orbit. And then the physics is really funny. It's very counterintuitive. You
Okay.
don't thrust towards the rocket. You actually do the opposite to shift orbits and be able to catch up.
But to speed up, you have to slow down.
Exactly. It's really counter. It actually fooled astronauts too, because in one of the first docking missions, the of course the astronauts were test pilots, so they started behaving like they were flying a jet, and then they realized they were wasting a ton of fuel trying to meet that last bit of rendezvous.
Uh,
Yeah, I think Michael Collins had wrote about that in his book Carrying the Fire. So yeah, that was a huge hurdle to do, and we did multiple rendezvous with Gemini.
In terms
Other
of
questions?
navigation in space, was there any chance they would use what we're using now, plate solving for navigation?
I'm sorry, what was that? What was that? What kind of solving?
Well, there's a thing called plate solving. You just point your camera at the sky and then
Ah,
plate solving.
plate solving. Okay, yes, yes, I know what that is. Thank you. I would imagine it's probably doable. I don't know. I'm more of a structures guy in aerospace, so I'm not as familiar with the navigation, but I imagine that would be a good technology because I know that with Apollo they actually used a sextant to be able to calibrate their guidance systems. So, and they actually trained over at the Griffith Observatory to do that. Um, but yeah, I imagine that would be a good technology. Yeah.
You didn't
But,
mention, but in the early Saturn days, Warner von Braun had the opinion that we just need to build one massive spaceship, the Nova, and we
yep,
would land an entire unit on the moon, and that would come all the way back to Earth.
yep.
The reasonings behind the cancellation, other than cost, was maybe a topic to talk about a little bit.
Yes. So what had happened is, and you can see this in 1950 science fiction movies, where the first thought was just do a straight shot to the moon, and you have your lander land on the moon and then take off and come back to Earth. Now the problem was uh, to do that, your lander has to have all the fuel to get back to Earth. So you're landing that fuel on the moon, and then you're taking that fuel and flying it back to Earth. So of course you need more fuel. Your spacecraft is heavier, and henceforth you need a much bigger booster to take off from the Earth. So that's why they had, as you were saying, the Nova rocket, which was actually even bigger than a Saturn V. So von Braun was fixed on that. Early in the Apollo program, there was an aerospace engineer named John Hobelt who actually wrote a paper and tried to go around management to say, hey, lunar orbit rendezvous is a much better plan because you have an orbiter whose only job is to go into lunar orbit and come back. And then you have basically a really lightweight ship just to go to the lunar surface and just to come back. You're not carrying all that return fuel. And he even said, I'm risking my career to do this. But to his credit, von Braun saw his presentation and then said, you know what? Your engineering makes a lot of sense. We're going to go with lunar orbit rendezvous. So John Hubelt. John Hubelt actually may have saved the Apollo program because that was a much easier thing to do than to build, the monster Nova rocket to pull off a faster mission, or excuse me, a one-shot mission. But again, you had the technical challenges of doing rendezvous, and that's one of the main purposes of Gemini was to prove out the ability to do orbital rendezvous. And
Recently, Russians fired a rocket, nuclear rocket, that
yes,
went orbit for I don't know. What's that all about?
I'm sorry, you broke up. Could you repeat the question, please?
Recently, the Russians fired a rocket that was in orbit for hours around the Earth, but was nuclear. What's that all
Yes.
about?
Yeah, you can use nuclear propulsion. Basically, you're sending heavy nuclear elements out the nozzle of a rocket, and with the higher mass particle that you're shooting out, you have more momentum exchange between the rocket and your exhaust. So that is a feasible technology, but it is dangerous as heck because if you have a launch accident and you also, you wouldn't want to be flying that in the atmosphere. That would just be a really bad day. So we did that research ourselves back in the 60s, but it just was not practical at the time. It could be very practical for like interplanetary travel, because then you don't care if you're shooting out radioactive material into the space. But yeah, in Earth,
Another,
it's a dicey idea.
another interesting fact, the GE built nuclear powered engines to go
Yep.
into space in San Jose, just between 101 and Capitol down there. It's now a shopping mall, but they tested them down past Gilroy in the mountains, running for over 5 hours. A nuclear engine blasting radiation out the back
Yep.
in the 70s.
Yep. One more note on that. This is an interesting to look up. There's the thing called Project Pluto, which was a nuclear powered cruise missile to deliver nuclear weapons. And it could stay aloft for a very, very long time. But again, the problem was that it had extremely toxic exhaust. And the thing was, you didn't need to drop a weapon with this thing. You just fly around the Soviet Union, contaminating every place, and you could, get just as much damage going. And they actually, I think that probably was a test that they did, but they did test fire these engines, and the weapons maker said, "This is just not right. This is not practical at all. This is just too crazy." So it never went beyond a few ground tests.
Any other questions?
Uh, Let me check if there's anything online. But yeah, happy to answer more questions.
I have a feeling about SpaceX. What have they done that had made them so successful in terms of their rockets in this past 10 years?
One thing they did something that the space shuttle could not do. They actually made reusability practical. So you look at like the Falcon launches or the Super Heavy launch, they're recovering their hardware. And the space shuttle did that too, but the problem with the space shuttle was that it still was not cost effective. They never got the cost of launching to orbit changed significantly with the shuttle because they discovered that their ability to turn it around and do all the maintenance on reusability was just a lot more expensive than they anticipated. Musk, on the other hand, has made it practical, and he has significantly lowered the cost of going to low Earth orbit. So, he does deserve credit for that. Oh. So yeah, and so yeah, he's done quite a bit of innovation. Now, I do not care for Starlink as an astronomer, and I'll set that aside and just point out to the engineering feats that he did pull off.
We were just at the Kennedy Space Center a couple of weeks ago, and it's a terrific place.
Yes.
I'm sure you've been there, but there's a full-size Saturn rocket, Saturn system that's horizontally placed. You can see SpaceX at a distance, and the presentations are really incredible and well done.
GSC too.
Yeah, that Saturn V at the Kennedy Space Center is impressive. I mean, it's a wow factor. You go, holy cow, this thing flew. 6+ million pounds on the pad.
Yeah,
The engines are gargantuan. Yeah, 1.5 million pounds of thrust just burning raw kerosene and liquid oxygen. Yeah.
all right. Let's thank Michael for a great presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me.